Okay, let's look at lesson 8. The empire has fallen. Evacuate now. The culmination of Revelation in its final chapters is this sort of contrast between these two cities. You could say it's a tale of two cities. And the one is evil Babylon, that's the Roman Empire, and the other is God's New Jerusalem. And we, as the people of God, then are put at a kind of fork in the road. And the call to us is to not choose this path, but to choose this one. And John uses a variety of strategies to convince people that the Roman Empire's trajectory, its path, is not healthy for them, in fact is dangerous, and they've got to get off that path and onto the path of God's way of life. So he does this with this image of the two cities, and Rome is called Babylon, which is interesting. That's picking up on, it's scripting Rome in the role of the ancient empire of Babylon, which had destroyed the city of Jerusalem some 600 years earlier. And we can forget how daring this is to call Rome Babylon. That is an empire that's already fallen, while Rome is still very much in power. I mean, John is kind of in advance giving this sort of funeral liturgy, or the funeral scene for the empire that was completely dominating people's lives. Now, we don't like the imagery that he uses in some of this, particularly depicting Rome as a woman. And I'm not going to try to justify it. I think it's terrible too, but just keep in mind that in languages that have gender, French, German, many others, table might be feminine, cup might be masculine. Every object has a gender, and it happens that the Greek word for city, polis, is feminine in gender, as it is in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew word for city is feminine. So therefore, when you personify cities, they will get personified as female images, and that's why then he's got this terrible image of the whore of Babylon riding around on the multi-headed beast with her cup of fornications that she's trying to use to poison the nations of the world. The only thing helpful about that image, I think, can be to see that there are aspects of empire and of our culture that are seductive to us, that can appear attractive but are very dangerous. But I think you need to move beyond that image of Rome and go to what's primary in chapter 18, which is the image of Rome as a city or as an empire, and not focus on the feminine aspects of it. And then in chapter 18, what you get is this amazing funeral scene. The fall of the Roman Empire in advance is sort of portrayed through the laments of those who have profited from it. The kings, the merchants, the mariners or seafarers, all of them who loved the Roman Empire and were made wealthy by it, they all weep and moan now as their whole empire collapses, goes up in flames right before their very eyes. And again, this is an in advance view of how John is saying to people, this whole thing is going to collapse. It's not going to last, and it's going to be a big funeral scene. So the elements of this vision, I think, that can really help us are to see how strong the economic dimension of John's critique of the Roman Empire is. The cargo list, for example, in chapter 18, verses 12 and 13. If you read through that, and it's modeled on a cargo list that's back in Isaiah, the fall of the hated empire of Tyre back hundreds of years earlier. But if you look at the items in that cargo list, the products of the nations that Rome has conquered, and how they're all having to ship their logs and their food products and their commodities into Rome. And John lives in a port city. He lived in Ephesus probably before he was on the island of Patmos. So he had seen the ships come and go. I mean, this amazing trade economy. He knew what was being carried on these ships. And the last item on the cargo list, I think, is really important for us. That is human lives. Human people are being traded as commodities. This is slaves. It's the Greek word bodies, or backs, you could say. And John, in this cargo list at the very end, gives us one of the very important New Testament critiques of the institution of slavery and slave trade. He says this whole Roman economy is sick, and the whole thing has got to collapse. And I think the slave trade is part of what he sees as such a terrible sickness. The key verse here for us, and for John's communities, is chapter 18, verse 4. Come out of her, my people, or come out of it. It's referring to the empire, so that you don't share in its sins and take part in its plagues. We are being called on this Exodus to come out of empire. and not to participate in this fall and judgment, this trial scene that's going to unfold here. So, of course, the question for us is, what does that look like? I mean, what does it mean to come out of empire? For John's churches, it's an Exodus journey, but they couldn't go somewhere. It's not like the Exodus where they could come out of Egypt and make their way up to Israel. No, they were called to undertake an Exodus right in the heart of the empire, right where they were. They were to come out of their participation in the culture and live differently. So we can ask, by analogy, what would that mean for us? What does it mean to come out? And what would that look like for our churches to be countercultural communities, if you will? And of course, we have to ask, what is the analogy to empire? Are we living in an empire? Well, it's the whole system that we're a part of. I think that Revelation can help us envision what it looks like to not participate in the injustices of our economic system, of our militaristic system, whatever it is, but to say, what does it look like to come out and for churches, for God's people, to live differently right in the midst of this system, to live as if we're already claimed by God, and modeling a different way of life, the power of Lamb power in our communities, and to be sort of witnesses to that power of God to make a difference in our world, that vision of hope, even while we're still living in the midst of our complex world. We can live differently as the communities of God. And I think that's the most important challenge of this lesson, is to ask, what does it mean for your church to live differently? And how are you going to model that, whether in caring for the poor or testifying about unjust policies or whatever that might look like for you? Think about what it means to come out of empire and how that verse can speak to you today.